just been released, and they were starting to think, or they had really just wrapped A Foreign Affair, and they were starting to think about Sunset Boulevard. And according to the book I read, Norma Desmond, the character of Norma Desmond, had kind of revealed themselves to them in 1943 while making The Major and the Minor. I don't know how it revealed themselves. I don't know how Norma revealed herself to them in 1943 when making The Major and the Minor, but apparently, not unfortunately, but apparently Norma revealed herself to them in 1943 when they were making The Major and the Minor. So in 1948, really Hollywood was kind of littered with these silent film stars who had been so big in silent film, but once the talkies came along, or really several years after the talkies had been implemented, they kind of faded away.
Yeah.
So there was, bringing it back to D.W. Griffith. D.W. Griffith was known at the time. He hadn't really made a picture since 1931. And during his, high star lift during 1915, 1916, he had become a megalomaniac. He had this huge ego, and he was known as the best filmmaker in the world. And yet his career ended in 1931. So by 1948, he had become this old stumbling drunk, and he would be found around different like Hollywood hotspots, such as Macombo or Romanovs. And he would always be completely drunk, and he'd be stumbling around these restaurants yelling at people, which were always the Hollywood elite, because these were the Hollywood elite watering holes. So in 1948, D.W. Griffith died, and Charles Brackett, who was the president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, Charles Brackett, who co-wrote Sunset Boulevard, was the president of that, and he gave his eulogy. And Louis B. Mayer and Samuel Goldwyn, who were old friends of D.W. Griffith, were the pallbearers. So it has been speculated that during that was kind of fueled their writing for Norma Desmond, like, the old Hollywood, old silent film stars kind of dying away. He, a big major part of silent films had just passed away. So in 1948, they both started work on writing Sunset Boulevard. They knew they wanted to have an old silent film Hollywood star that was faded into oblivion, that was kind of diluted by her past, such as Norma Desmond. And so they sat together for a long time, and they tried to come up with a film that was based around like Norma Desmond's character, and they couldn't do it. So then they opened up their doors to the office. So then they'd have people come in constantly, all of the stars, all of the different people that worked at the studios. They would come in, they'd play cards, they'd have drinks, they'd talk about Sunset Boulevard. And finally, somebody said, well, how about a relationship between an old silent film star, female, such as Norma Desmond, and a young man that she's kind of trapped in her clutches? And they were like, yes, we will do that.
That's it.
Yes. So then they started work on Sunset Boulevard, and it didn't go as quickly as they thought it would. So then Paramount hired another writer, not D.W. Griffith. His last name was Marshman. And you can find it in the credits on Sunset Boulevard, Marshman's first name. The reason that he was hired, because Billy Wilder, Charles Brackett had written, and then Billy Wilder directed, Charles Brackett produced a film called The Emperor Waltz, which they both hated. It was a Technicolor musical for Paramount, and they put that on, and it was a terrible, terrible film. And it had a delayed release from when it was made in 1946. It was finally released in 1948, and I think it was D.A. Marshman. I don't know. My notes are just all over the place now, so who knows if this is correct or not. But he had been invited to a screening, like a preview screening of that movie, and he came up to him afterwards and he told them how terrible it was. So they were like, well, we completely agree with you. How would you like to help us write Sunset Boulevard? So they weren't exactly sure of how they were going to write Sunset Boulevard, so they would write a few pages at a time. And once they wrote a finished script, it always would have to be submitted to the production code office for them to then be like, all right, you have our seal of approval. You can go ahead and make the film. But because they weren't exactly sure how the film was going to work, writing it from day to day, they would only submit a few pages at a time to the production code office.
And I also thought it was a little sneaky. It was kind of like, because a lot of that stuff would not get passed otherwise. There is no way they would have allowed this whole thing as a whole to be submitted. But if you only submit a couple pages at a time, you can kind of creep stuff in.
Right. Well, exactly. And what I was going to say is the 1948 film Foreign Affair was the first film in Hollywood to really characterize, and we talked about this a little bit in our pre-discussion, GIs as kind of the horn dogs that they were, because before that, GIs were characterized as like good-hearted American boys that blew
They're
off
the
steam.
heroes.
Right. They blew off steam by palling around and roughhousing. Well, in
Hanging out.
1940, yeah, yeah, that's how I blow off steam. So in
Hang out with
1940,
the boys.
you're right. You hang out with the boys and you roughhouse. That's how you blow off
That's
steam.
it.
But in 1948, with the film A Foreign Affair, Billy Wilder, Charles Brackett really characterized the GIs as like how they really blew off steam, which we can't talk about on this podcast because we'll be rated. But then also they had two female characters in that film: Jean Arthur, who played an American congresswoman, and then Marlene Dietrich, who was like a European cafe singer. But she was also kind of a madam in that film. And the film characterized Marlene Dietrich's character really as morally superior to Jean Arthur's. So then, who was an American congresswoman. So then that film was condemned on the floor of Congress, which they had to be careful about because the blacklist started in 1947. And nobody wanted to be blacklisted at this point because, they would
never work again.
Right, they would never work again, really. So they started writing Sunset Boulevard in increments of a few pages each at a time, which is really all that they could do because they weren't exactly sure where this picture was going to go, even when they were shooting. So they were turning in a few pages at a time to the production code office. They kept the production underground, closed doors. Billy Wilder told the Paramount heads that they were making a movie called Can of Beans.
I love that line. It's a can of beans.
Now, at the time, the head of Paramount Studios was a man named Adolf Zucker, who was an old man. They pretty much just had to prop him up in boardrooms, make sure he was still breathing. But he didn't have a whole lot of say of what was coming out of the studio at that point, so they could get away with making something like Sunset Boulevard. Now, if they had been working at Fox under Daryl Zanuck or at MGM under Louis B. Mayer, that would have been a totally different story because they were both very involved in like the type of pictures each studio was making.
Yes.
So they were turning in this script a few pages at a time, and every single time they turn in a few pages, they'd hear back from the production code office, okay, these few pages are, perfectly fine, but we can't sign off on it until we have the full script. But they'd be like, but since you just have these few pages, we'll sign off on it. So they'd sign off on a few pages at a time. And I can only imagine when they got the full script, they were like, what have we done?
Well, you signed off on it. You can't take back.
I know. We're done. Well, first you have, at the time, it was a very considered nasty little affair between an older woman and a younger man, where she's pretty much his sugar mama. And then you have the whole thing about revealing the very dark side of the Hollywood studio system, because it was all about exploitation and how we can exploit our contract stars through the studio contract system. So then, even before the picture was finished being written, they started casting the film. And I think it's amazing. I don't know if many people realize this or not, but just like even the casting, how closely they mirrored the characters that they were playing in the film. Yes. So we'll start with Gloria Swanson, who is playing Norma Desmond. Gloria Swanson had been one of Paramount's head contract players during the 1920s. She had since kind of fallen into oblivion in the mid-1930s. She and Billy Wilder had actually worked together before on a film called Music in the Air in 1934 at Fox, which flopped. And that was kind of another nail in the coffin for Gloria Swanson's career. Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder were good friends with Greta Garbo because they had written Ninotchka for Greta Garbo at MGM in 1939. And so they first went to Greta Garbo when they had this idea of like Norman Desmond character. And they went to her and they were like, how would you like to make a comeback? And she was very happy, living in a secluded lifestyle. Then they went to Mae West, very, very closely mirrored the character of Norma Desmond, but they went to Mae West. And apparently she wasn't shocked by the script because she had many...
She can't be shocked by most of anything. It's Mae West.
She over-sexualized everything, and she was having affairs with many younger men at the time.
Of course.
And Yeah, she was
Just
living in
another
this.
day in the life of Mae West.
I know. If we could only all live like Mae West, wouldn't that be
Gosh,
wonderful?
what an
Um,
icon.
because she hadn't been in the pictures since the 1930s, or really 19 or early 1940s, and she lived in this very big, beautiful, I believe it was an apartment that was designed by Hans Dreyer, who was the production designer at Paramount. And she was kind of insistent on rewrite. She wanted to rewrite some of it to make it over sexualized, and you do
To
not
make it fit
rewrite
her
a Billy
style.
White. What? Yeah.
To make
Oh,
it fit her style. She always got to rewrite things because she had to have her own flair to it.
exactly. And you did not rewrite a Billy Wilder picture. The actor said even though if it took him a long time to get the script in place and write it, that they had to be word for word verbatim when they were shooting the film, or he would stop and he'd tell them the correct word and then they'd have to go back and do it again. So Charles Brackett, Billy Wilder were not going to let Mae West rewrite their film.
Yeah.
So then they went to Mary Pickford. And Mary,
that went over well.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit before about what happened with Mary Pickford, but she and her husband Douglas Fairbanks had they had formed United Artists with Charlie Chaplin in the 1920s because they did not like the control that the studio system held over them. So they created their own studio so they could create their own work. Now Mary Pickford had kind of faded into oblivion at the end of the silent pictures, and so they approached Mary Pickford. So I've heard several accounts. The account about that interaction that I've heard most about is she was shocked that anything like that could ever be written. But then, according to a biographer, like a ghostwriter for Mary Pickford, he said that she was not shocked. But this biographer stated about Mary Pickford that she wanted her name above the actor that was playing Joe Gillis. Yes. Above his name in the titles, and they would not give that to her. So whether she had been shocked or whether she could not get title billing, they weren't going to use Mary Pickford. Now, they also went to another Paramount star, a Polish Paramount star that was a big star in the silent film age, called Pola Negri. Pola Negri had been, she had really been Hollywood royalty. She had been married to different European royalty. And at the time that she was at Paramount, Gloria Swanson was at Paramount. They were constantly competing against one another. Or so the Paramount press machine through the Hollywood fan magazines were saying that they hated each other. They were constantly at each other's throats, which according to Gloria Swanson, they didn't mind each other at all. They actually liked each other. But that brings us to another thing. Pola Negri had a pet leopard that she would walk up and down Sunset Boulevard with. And so just move. What?
Oh, what a power move.
Oh, I know.
Pre-Tiger King. She's hanging out with...
Pola Negri was the OG Tiger King. How about that? But just the amount of leopard print that costume designer Edith Head put into that film for Norma Desmond was kind of a callback to Pola Negri. Pola Negri was shocked, though. She was like, absolutely not. I am not a faded silent film star. She was just as deluded as Norma Desmond, so she wouldn't do it. So Billy Wilder, Charles Brackett were good friends with director George Cukor, which directed like The Women, A Star is Born with Judy Garland, My Fair Lady. He was a great big film director. He really worked most with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy at MGM during the 1940s. So they were at tea in George Cukor's garden, as you did in 1948 Hollywood. Yes. And he said, well, what about Gloria Swanson? Because during the 1920s, George Cukor had been really, really good friends with Gloria Swanson, and they hadn't even thought about her. At that time, Gloria Swanson had really not made a picture since 1934. She hadn't really made a successful film since the late 1920s.
Mm-hmm. She'd done like play work, if I recall correctly, if I remember her history. She moved kind of into plays for a while.
She'd been on Broadway and stuff like that. But in 1948, when she got the call from Billy Wilder and Paramount, would like for you to come out and do a screen test for this film. She was working. She had her own lifestyle and like cooking show on a New York television network in 1948. And so she got that call. And of course, according to her biographer, she was very offended when they said, would you do a screen test? Because she was like, a screen test? Without me, there wouldn't be any Paramount Studios, just like Norma Desmond.
It's a fact for both of them, both in character and out, that it's true. Like both of them made the studios.
They did, yes. And she was good friends with George Cukor at that time again. So she called him and he encouraged her. He said, just go out there, do the screen test. You will not be sorry. So she went out. I can't remember if she did the screen test in New York or California, but she did a screen test. They saw it and they were like, yes, she'll be absolutely